what, I guess, in a nutshell, is panpsychism? And you also said that, or you pointed to some literature that argues that dualism has been the most common view. But how long has panpsychism been around?
Panpsychism has been around as long as philosophy, as far as we know, in both East and West. There's a long tradition. Big Enlightenment philosophers, or Leibniz, Spinoza have something at least close to a panpsychist view. Had something of a heyday in the 19th century. Fell out of favor in the post-war years. I think there was a strong materialist turn at this point and an anti-metaphysics turn. And it's only in the last 10 or 15 years, maybe pushing 20 years now, that there's been a return of taking panpsychism seriously as a third option that needs to be on the table, needs to be reckoned with. But panpsychism is essentially the view that consciousness goes all the way down to the fundamental building blocks of reality. It doesn't literally mean that everything is conscious. The basic idea is that the basic building blocks of reality have some kind of very simple experience, subjective experience, and that the very complex experience of the human or animal brain is somehow built up from consciousness at these simple forms of consciousness at the level of basic physics. So a panpsychist needn't think this cup is conscious, has its own unified conscious experience, but they may very well think the smallest particles making up the cup have some kind of very simple experience. That's the basic position.
Mm-hmm. And as you've said a few times, it's a pretty radical position. What motivates it, other than the rejection of dualism and physicalism?
As I say, I think we just need to, as you would in science, you got some data, you look at the different theories, and see how well they do. So I think the data here is it's not scientific data, it's philosophical data. What is the data that well, is it scientific or is it philosophical? It's kind of difficult because consciousness is not something we know about from experiments. It's not, we didn't discover it looking down a microscope. We know about consciousness just because you're immediately aware of your feelings and experiences. But anyway, what we know is that consciousness and the physical world are correlated in some way, right? I take it that's the starting point. Certain kinds of brain activity bring a... Let me say that more carefully. I nearly slipped into physicalism then. Certain kinds of brain activity are correlated with certain kinds of conscious experience. Everyone agrees on that. What's the best explanation of that? There's the dualist option. Well, not very simple. Let's try and avoid that. And then there's the physicalist and the panpsychist option. And you just have to look at how well they do at their explanations. I've said the physicalist doesn't do very well at the attempt to explain consciousness in terms of physical processes in the brain. The panpsychist tries to do it the other way around. Starts off with consciousness and tries to explain physical reality in terms of underlying facts about consciousness. So you see, if consciousness and physical reality are correlated, connected together, there's two ways of explaining that. Maybe the physical world is the first thing and consciousness pops out, or maybe consciousness is the first thing and the physical world pops out. And I just think the panpsychist has a much clearer... It's got an explanation, it's got a workable explanation for how to make sense of physical reality popping out of consciousness, whereas the physicalist attempt, for all the reasons I've given, doesn't look so hot. So should I tell you about how they try to explain it, or...
Sure. Well, let me know if this question let me ask a question. You can tell me if it's better answered after the explanation. But just clarifying this idea of philosophical data, and so it's the philosophical data that electrons or strings have some primitive mentality. The data that we know that brain activity and mental activity are correlated, but we don't have a good physical answer for that. So it's sort of this idea that strings, electrons, primitive particles have mentality just follows from this?
I wouldn't say it's the data that strings or particles have consciousness. That's part of the hypothesis to explain the data. Yeah, I mean, we don't have.
Yes. That's what I meant.
Yeah, right. So the data is just, that there are these two things we know about in quite different ways. That's why this is another way of saying why it's not a straightforward scientific issue. Science is about accounting for observable data, experimental data, whereas here we've got the experiment. There's two things we know about in quite different ways. There's the physical world we know about with our senses and through doing science, and then there's consciousness that we know about just through being conscious, right? You can't see consciousness. I can't look in your brain and see your experiences. We just know about it because we are conscious. And we know these two things are connected. And the question is, how are they connected? That's the question. And the panpsychist says, well, consciousness is at the fundamental level, and the physical world emerges from consciousness, and that's why they're connected.